Okay, so let's get started. Well, some people come in as I'm speaking. So welcome everyone to our second workshop on entrepreneurial finance and innovation seminar series of the fall. Before I introduce our speaker, let me go through the format. We have a 40-minute presentation, followed by a 15-minute discussion, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. If you have a question for the speaker or the discussant, feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. Song and I will be monitoring that. If you have a clarifying question that you think will be easy to answer, I suggest using that in the chat. It kind of helps us separate that. Otherwise, we're not going to interrupt unless it's a clarifying and relatively quick question. But keep the questions coming, and they will be answered in time. So with that, I think that's all the details for our format. I'm happy to introduce Adair Morse from UC Berkeley, who's going to present some work on small business survival capabilities and policy effectiveness with evidence from Oakland. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My screen looks okay. Michael, thumbs up. Good. Okay. All right. Thanks again. This is a joint work with Bobby Bartlett here at Berkeley Law School I've been working with. So the idea here is pretty simple, is that, we use the word small business, which we used to not use very much in the finance literature, but we use it in general in the macro literature and just in policy and the media to account for a huge swath of the economy. Most of firms in the economy are small businesses, and we assume that small businesses are homogeneous in characteristics, and thus that the policy implications would be the same for all small businesses. And that seemed to us at this point in time not to be obvious, that that's probably too broad. And so what our contribution here is to understand heterogeneities of small businesses as it relates to survival capabilities. And by capabilities, we have in mind something of an endowment concept of how businesses facing any kind of macro revenue shock, how they adapt. Then we're going to map what we do from some estimates on the survival capabilities to different types of policy programs, just in a mapping of thinking through it. And then we're going to test the implications for the PPP program, in all this in data from Oakland, California. So the idea of this, partially was event driven. We were helping the city of Oakland look at their survey in early March this year, which was super early for them to already be doing a small business survey. And we noticed immediately there were big differences in firm labor and expected survival forecasts by firm size. And so once there was that realization, then we went to the macro literature and realized that non-employers and micro businesses are in some ways very different entities than larger small businesses. So if you look at some of the work by the macro people, the larger small businesses actually provide for jobs growth, whereas the smaller ones, is a whole different literature, are providers of community vibrancy, establishments, and establishments then fill into spillovers to the local economy in terms of supporting the property base and the tax bases, right, which have large implications even if they're not jobs growth providers, which is sort of missed in the conversation in the media. So just reinforcing in that point, as we talk about policy, it's a welfare decision of a social planner to think about, where the role of these two in terms of your policy, or in terms of having jobs growth, but also keeping the property base and the tax base from local main streets, keeping out zombie main streets. Okay, so that's a question beyond here, but just pointing out that it's not obvious that jobs growth is the only name of the game here. Okay, so the outline of what I want to do, I'm going to talk about frames for thinking about survival capabilities to set up our estimation. We're going to highlight quickly 3 types of policy programs, and then I'm going to get into showing you data from Oakland and survival capability results by firm size. And then I'm going to map that to policy choices and do a test of the PPP as it relates to the findings. Okay, but let me start with sort of this is maybe ex post rationalizing, but a frame to help us think through different small businesses. It's not just about different types of industries. So here I've got 3 types of restaurants. I have a bakery that is a non-employer, has no employees. The owner does everything. I have a taqueria that there are 3 cooks that are the only employees. They do everything, kind of the jack of all trades. And a pizza restaurant that's a bigger thing that hires 20 workers, wait staff, as well as some cooks. The key difference when you think about these things is the pizza restaurant would naturally, facing a revenue shock, would naturally flex to lay off some of the wait staff who are non-essential in some ways, right? If the revenues are declined, they're not core, they don't have as much specific human capital. But the taqueria, they cannot, in some sense, they can't just lay off cooks because the cooks are the whole business, right? Without closing, you don't have that flexibility. And the taqueria differs from the bakery, who also, it's just the owner, where the bakery is just the entrepreneur deciding about their own savings account, their own choices about unemployment insurance and closing down. And non-pecuniary utility, we know these people get from running a small business. There's that trade-off, and so the taqueria is kind of stuck because they have to continue to employ these 3 workers to stay open. So these are sort of just some stereotypes of things to think through, and how immediately you can start brainstorming on that. These are the survival capabilities of these 3 are different. Okay, simple accounting frame just to set up what we're going to do. This is, I'm cheating somewhere between an income statement and a cash flow statement, but I want to sort of think in a cash flow concept, that cash flows equal revenues, net revenues, backing out inventory costs, minus labor, minus committed costs, right? Way too simple, but basic principles here. If we think about a negative macro shock here, and I've denoted R subscript negative, that imposes a unit loss of revenue on average, but different businesses have different shocks. We can define survival as keeping cash flow positive. Okay, and here I've just said, your existing cash flow and then the adjustment due to the shock. Okay, right? So if that's some sort of loose definition of survival, then we can think of just some comparative statics here. What are your survival capabilities? So first is, as you can see here, the revenue resiliency, how your revenue holds up after this shock. The second would be your labor flexibility, right? And I'm using that flexibility term meaning laying off labor, which is a negative in society, but for the firm, the ability to have flexibility is a positive in some sense, right? But or a capability to survive. And I don't mean to be nonchalant about people losing their jobs, but labor flexibility has 2 pieces: how labor flexes with revenue, and just some independent labor shock. So we'll consider both of those pieces empirically. And finally, how much committed costs you have, as well as how that committed cost flexes, if any, or has any restructuring, right? And it may be that this C rather than the derivative is more important in this simple frame. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to look at these 3 things empirically: revenue resiliency, labor cost flexibility, and committed costs, and I'm going to do it by firm size and see how the different capabilities relate to firm size, right? So that's where I'm going. When I get through with that, I am going to cross what I find with these types of programs. So let me queue up these programs, and you can see immediately how they're going to map very easily, although that was not contrived. This is an ex post realization. These things map to my simple accounting frame. So first we have subsidized working capital loans. So these are loans that are tied to revenues. So more in line with what the idea of the Main Street program would be, but applied for small businesses. There's a number of different programs that look like this. They're very different from the second type of subsidized loans or grants, which are PPP-like, tied to labor costs. You're keeping your labor employed and you get a subsidy based on that, right? So those two things are different approaches to getting loans or subsidized loans or even grants to businesses, one based on revenue, the other based on labor. And finally, something that's not been talked as much about, but surely is hovering on the economy right now, lease and debt repayment structuring subsidies, right? We saw the HAMP after the last crisis, right, where we restructured the mortgages. This is the impending, about to happen kind of discussion that's already happening in the side wings, but not as getting as much press yet. So these, if you think about these types of programs, they map very naturally to my revenue resiliency, labor flexibility, and committed cost. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that at the end. Okay, so here's Oakland, right? A picture of Oakland. I just put this picture up just to show you Oakland is not just a commuter city to San Francisco, which is across the bay in this picture, right? Oakland's in the forefront, big port, a fair amount of downtown businesses, and I have some stats here, right? Oakland, the city itself is 433,000 people and employs 205,000 people with a median income of 68, and the cost of living is high, right? It's London times 112. Notably, the shelter in place in Oakland was on March 16th for our county here. The city of Oakland implemented a small business survey the second week of March, even before the shelter in place. Had a lot of forethought in getting that together. The sample we're going to use here for this part of the data is about 1,000 small businesses, about 11% of the small business owners. The data sources, in addition to that City of Oakland small business survey, I'm going to show you some manual collected data on those small businesses that Oakland surveys. I'm going to match up these data with the SafeGraph foot traffic data from cell phones. I'm going to also match to home-based employee and wage data. This is a payroll data source that many people are using. And then there's a second City of Oakland small business survey that's going to cover the PPP that was implemented in June. Okay, so those are my data, just give you a flavor. These are the industries covered, and when I put in industry effects, fixed effects, these will be what I've done. We manually created these to make sense from looking up each of the small businesses in the 1,000. So we put fitness together, medical offices, so we could control for essential businesses. And we've divided personal services into those that are kind of on Main Street versus that have a shop versus those that are servicing something at home, so that our fixed effects do a better job of leveling the playing field. I'm interested in the differences across industries, but here what I'm studying is within the industry firm size. Okay, so the average employees in our sample from the survey is 6.5. With 761 out of the 1,000 having some employees, and the difference of that being non-employers, the median being has 2 employees, right? So these are small businesses. I've categorized them throughout the paper. I'm going to use these 3 categories just for exposition purposes. I've categorized the businesses into non-employers, micro businesses, which range from 1 to 5 employees, and enterprises, which are from 6 to 50. Okay, yeah, so that's yes. And when I run the estimations, I'm going to do log workers, which is going to be defined as the natural log of 1 plus employees, to count the owner as an employee as well as the worker, as the owner as a worker as well as the employees. Okay, so that's going to be my specifications. Some control. Yes, please.
Quick question. So you mentioned essential business. Maybe it's going to come up here, but you have it. So I think you're going to answer. I was going to ask, within industry, do you know which firms are essential?
That was part of the reason I manually looked up these 1,000 and not just took the medical terminology to be, or even to be able to say which ones are grocery stores and liquor stores among the retail, because those are considered as essential here. And so we manually look those up, and 11% of our sample are essential, right? So I've also put, placed them on Main Street versus at a venue, home, or offsite, right? So I'm going to control for that too, because I'm interested in that Main Street aspect. An interim outcome, this is also from looking up as of May 1st. I did this the 2 weeks leading up to May 1st when things started opening up again here slightly, was categorizing these as permanently closed or lacking an ongoing concern signal, temporarily closed, trying. This is like doing takeout only, if you will. So reduced model of some sort, or fully open. And this process, we started on Google Maps. We looked them up on Yelp. We looked them up their websites. We did a series of 4 steps to make sure consistency across the 4 to code these. Okay, I'm going to present the outcome measures as I present the results, just so it's clear. Okay, so the first outcome is revenue resiliency. So here's the first measure. I'm going to have 2 measures of revenue resiliency. The first one is a survey data from the city of Oakland, where these buckets here, the percentage change gross decline year over year March. These are the buckets that the Oakland survey had. I have the same variable for February, which I'm going to control for in the specification. So here's my specification note. I've made this a continuous variable, a log at the mean. These are too many buckets with my data sample, including industry, essential, and Main Street fixed effects. I just can't estimate some sort of ordered logit thing here. So I make this a continuous variable with log the percentage change receipts decline at the median of these ranges. What I'm interested in is how that is affected by this log workers pre, right? I have pre and post, but I'm going to fix everything as pre, that the Oakland survey covered what was your employment before the crisis. Okay, the second revenue resiliency variable I'm going to use is foot traffic. So foot traffic from cell phones, the SafeGraph people are starting to use. Over 30 million individuals, cell phone tracking. Here's Oakland is in Alameda County is here, which has a high density of these cell phones being tracked. And the nice thing about this is we can see the establishment, we can map the establishment to my Oakland data, my survey data. So I know the number of pre-workers from the survey data. I can map it by name and location to the SafeGraph data. And then the foot traffic, I don't need a model of getting foot traffic to revenue. I can do within just how much the foot traffic declined as a percentage for how your revenue declined by doing a within firm study here. So let me show you what the foot traffic data looks like. I just picked out 4 industries just to give you an idea. So groceries is green, comes along, spikes up and collapses, and then not quite back, right? As we know that pattern. Where the other 3, are going along here: electronics, electronics, restaurants, and fitness, going along here, total collapse, right? Where the electronics and appliance comes back, where things where you're doing experience, consumption, fitness, and restaurants don't come back as of May, right? And so these are the data I'm going to use for the revenue resiliency, just turning that in. This is the same picture, turning that into an estimating equation, log foot traffic. What I'm interested in is I'm going to absorb the time, and I'm going to absorb your own effect. And I'm interested in the log workers pre times the post indicator after the crisis. Okay, let me show you those 2 sets of results together. So just focusing on the most stringent estimations, columns 4 and 6. What we find is that the larger small businesses, so here's log workers, the larger the small business, the more the decline, right? This is a decline, so positive numbers, more decline. Also the non-employers. So you can see what's excluded here is the micro business, 1 to 5, are going to have lower decline in revenues. The same exact pattern we see in the foot traffic. This is foot traffic, so negative sign is more decline. Larger and the non-employers have more decline. Let me put those into pictures rather. I'm going to do this whole thing in pictures rather than these estimations. So here's the Oakland survey data, showing you the marginal effects predicted by these three groups by size. And so, you know, there are a couple of things. I've scaled all of my pictures from 0 to 1, so I'm not just adjusting to scale up and down so it looks like a bigger effect, right? All of them are large, you know, but still having some revenue resiliency. As of this survey, the first survey are late March and throughout April. So we're seeing, you know, 40–50% decline in revenues in these data. The other thing you notice is the yellow and red are different. They're statistically different. In particular, the micro business ward off 14% of the shock relative to enterprises. Okay, translating that into the foot traffic safe graph data, exactly the same pattern. Again, the red are the micro businesses. Everyone, you know, the first thing you notice is the decline is huge here, right? Everyone take this massive hit, as we know, but the red do better. And I've absorbed everything is why the lines are all the same here, and you're just picking up the time effects and the size effects, right? So that's the stringency of the estimation. In particular, the micro businesses ward off 8% of the shock relative to others. So the taqueria, if you will, is more nimbly able to keep a portion of the revenues. All right, so that's the first punchline in terms of revenue resiliency. Whether these effects are large or not, in terms of, you know, 8 to 14%, we can debate about that, but that's the first result. Turning to labor flexibility. So here's again my framework. I'm interested in these two pieces for labor flexibility. How is it, whether the scaling changes relative to revenues, and then just the overall, whether there's an independent effect that is unrelated to the revenue shock. Okay, and so I need to, because of that, I need to control for revenue, the revenue loss. Okay, so I'm going to take the average over the standardized version of those two measures that I just showed you, that percentage change decline in revenue, and then the foot traffic as an index for revenue. Okay, so I have a firm specific index for revenue decline, and then I'm going to study the percentage change of workers in Oakland. I have two measures, right? So here's my percentage change, what it looks like for Oakland, where I'm going to estimate this as a fractional logit. It's just a continuous variable here, not buckets. I have actual worker counts. And whether that fractional logit is affected by what your pre-worker size was, and then whether that interacts with your revenue loss, right? Those are the two pieces. And then my second labor flexibility measure is the home base headcount and wages, right? This is a payroll provider, home bases. And so in home base, I don't see the name of the small business. So I'm going to map home base to foot traffic using zip code industry mappings. So the average zip code industry. You know, that has its limitations, but as a complement to the Oakland survey data, you'll see they look very similar. One thing I should note, there's a number of papers using home base, and you note here that the head count and the wages have different observations in my sample. This is true nationally as well as just in Oakland. And we looked into this. It turns out that the wages data coverage after the crisis falls out relative to the headcount data. And so there seems to be some sort of bias in being able to use wages after the crisis in this particular data set, just, you know, for whatever that's worth. So again, here on my estimating equation, I like the safe graph. I'm going to absorb firm and time, and I'm interested in this pre-worker as it interacts with post, and pre-worker as it interacts with post, and the revenue variable. Okay, let me show you the results. So the first piece from this is the part-time and full-time workers in the survey data, is that skipping the labor use labor use scales with revenue, unsurprising. But more importantly, beyond the revenue declines, large or small businesses use labor flexibility as their survival strategy. So the pizza restaurant in my example, they do lay off more of the wait staff relative to the taqueria. That's unsurprising once you put it in that context. Let me show you the pictures. The pictures are always much better. So here's the red and the yellow. I can't have blue because those are non-employers. So we're just down to two categories here. And the enterprises lay off 38% of full-time workers and 50% more or less of part-time workers. And the micro businesses lay off only half of them, a little bit less than half actually, right? When we turn to the home-based data, and I'm going to find a similar pattern in the estimation table. Let me go right to the figure. So in the figure, enterprises cut back labor by 50%, where micro businesses by 26%. These are incredibly comparable numbers between the Oakland survey data and the this home-based data applied in Oakland. So the taqueria uses labor flexibility half as much as the pizza restaurant is kind of the punchline there. I can do this in the home-based data nationally, and the patterns are very similar. Just to note. Finally, coming to committed cost, the third of the three survival capabilities. I can't see committed cost in my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take guidance from that framework and say, once we've taken account of heterogeneities in labor and revenue, residual closure risk can be a proxy for committed cost. So I have this variable, how concerned are you about your business closing in the survey data from Oakland? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this closure risk variable as a, and then I'm going to absorb the revenue loss. I'm going to absorb the decline in workers. I'm going to even absorb those interim outcomes that I showed you before, whether you're trying your fully closed, fully open, or temporarily closed. I'm going to absorb how you were coming into the year, whether you were declining and Main Street and so forth. And I'm going to estimate this ordered logit to see how this varies by size. Okay, and so rather than show you this, I'm going to show you this. So the same color pattern, and what we find is that note the yellow here. The yellow is 11% have a greater outlook of being very concerned about closure than the micro business, and another 11% greater than the blue, which is the non-employers. So enterprises seem to have, the way I want to interpret it, and again, this is just me putting intuition behind that, is the larger establishments face a greater role of capital and thus debt and property costs, right? You have more leases, you have more capital investment in the infrastructure and so forth in your business, right? That makes sense. Okay, so what I've done then now is I've estimated these simple capabilities, and I'm going to map them to policy. So just checking my clock. So what I've got here is, let me just talk through what the results I find and then how that relates to policy. So let's take the enterprise. So the enterprise, we found that the enterprise, what are their capabilities? They have low capabilities around committed cost, right? These are a problem for them. They have high capabilities around labor flexibility. This is their strategy. And then kind of not so good on revenue resiliency. But their strategy is about labor flexibility. So now you think about these three types of policies. Well, you can immediately see that the PPP, the labor policies that say, oh, keep your workers on, are a terrible idea. I'm going to use a less strong word, are not likely to be a great idea for businesses that need to rely on labor flexibility for survival. Now, that's kind of a one-sided statement in that I'm thinking through the small business point of view and not society and labor point of view there, right? But it's unlikely to help them on survival because this is their only mechanism for survival. So what would be better for them for survival would be restructuring, lease restructuring, committed costs, debt restructuring, other kinds of programs, or to the extent that they're able to get revenues back, program loans that are based on their resiliency to revenue. Okay, now cross that with the micro business. Let's talk about the micro business. What do the micro businesses do? They have no flexibility or very low flexibility on labor. They keep the 3 cooks employed. Sorry, I'm pointing the wrong one. They have lower committed costs than the enterprises. So that's a positive for them, but really for the micro business, they seem to just have a higher revenue resiliency, figuring out ways to keep their revenue going because they have to keep these, or they choose to keep the 3 cooks employed, right? But to stay open, they need the 3 cooks. So what does that mean in terms of programs? These labor cost type programs like the PPP would be ideally suited for this type of business that needs to be able to keep the core employees employed. That's all their employees are all core. So of course that is a very fine-tuned program for this type of business. The revenues program is also makes sense for micro businesses. The debt restructuring, leasehold restructuring, these sort of things, less important to them relative compared to the enterprises. Okay, and finally, the non-employers are the last one to think about. What do? They only moderate on revenue resiliency. The labor cost flexibility is related to them themselves closing down the shop and getting pandemic unemployment, right? That was what their choices. But they have low cost, and so their choices really are about whether to try to get revenue from them working versus try to getting revenue from claiming unemployment insurance or being out of the workforce, right? And so here and again, labor incentives would work, right? And we see, in terms of being able to keep themselves working and still getting subsidies that way. And also the revenue resiliency, but again, the restructuring programs on committed costs are less effective for these. Okay.
Adair, can I ask a quick question on this? So PPP could be used for a non-employer. So if I run my own business, I could essentially subsidize my own wages?
Yeah, so, the pandemic unemployment insurance, which you think of as being an employee, right? The non-employers can actually take it for themselves. So I think of that, this check mark is not being about the PPP so much, but about the unemployment type programs that apply to non-employers, right? So I'm mixing, this is not, I didn't write PPP here because there's other things that fit in this category. So the PPP is really right here, comparing these two. Totally right, and I'm sorry if I minced words wasn't super clear on that. Okay, but now since you mentioned PPP, that's what the final thing I'm going to do here. So in June, Oakland implemented a survey 2 to ask in particular about some of these policies, and they did more than just the PPP, asking about the PPP, but in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the PPP. Now, the survey is small. It's 278 businesses that they surveyed the businesses that previously participated. And so, we have to take this with a grain of salt, but we'll see how much grain of salt we need. And so, this is I should add a lot more here. But the evidence is mounting on the PPP. The first wave of evidence, these 2 really important papers found that the PPP did not increase the labor use. However, both of these papers are only focused on labor use and not survival, but also they're also generally studying bigger firms than what I've got here. And so what the interesting thing though, out of the Granjo, right, we learned that their instrument of when you applied for a PPP, whether you got it or not often was related to your financial institution, what your bank was, as opposed to some sort of eligibility criteria. There were very low eligibility criteria. In this Oakland survey, the city of Oakland cleverly asked people if they applied, and then we have successfully applied or unsuccessfully applied, and those differences are not related to eligibility, but rather, according to Grange et al., are mostly related to what your bank is. So it's going to be independent of actually the firm to a certain degree, which I'm going to use to be able to push on that I'm able to identify the effect of PPP on survival. Okay, so this is how I'm going to think about identifying. So I'm interested in whether you're taking the PPP affected survival, and particularly given the negative literature that says the PPP was ineffective. And so here I'm speaking, I've rewritten what I just said. There may be differences in setting that would lead to participating in the PPP. And so I'm going to assume the application success is orthogonal to observable factors affecting medium run survival, because we know there are very low eligibility criteria for getting a PPP. It's largely an artifact of banks. Now one can push on me that who you bank with says something different about your firm structure, and I agree with that pushing on me, but I'm gonna do the best I can with the data I have. So I'm gonna also, I also have these action taken variables. I'm gonna control for what you're currently doing, and I'm gonna control for your operating status variable in the interim, and really focus on a variable that asks you, are you able to survive with what you have now over 6 months? And so I'm going to use that forecast variable as my effect on survival. So just jumping to that punchline, what I'm showing you here, and I'm going to focus on the shaded, is controlling for whether you applied for the PPP. How did acceptance of the PPP affect your survival? And does that vary by firm size? Okay, so that's what I'm asking. Again, we can only go so far with 278 observations, but here are all my controls. I have industry, gender, race. I have status, which is whether you're open, fully open, reduced, temporarily closed, or fully closed. I have your action steps, which is about furloughing employees or laying off, different steps of what you're doing with your employees, and so forth. Okay, so here's the results. So the PPP had no effect on short-term closing. That's not surprising, but in medium term, the PPP acceptance increased medium run survival by somewhere from 20 to 27% relative to those who applied and were rejected. This, however, dissipates with size. So let's look at that picture. Here's the punchline to the PPP result, is that if you were a small business, a non-employer, or micro business, the PPP was hugely successful in increasing the probability of survival. I don't know if hugely successful, but I consider 20 to 30% to be hugely successful. Increasing, you're saying that you're able to survive for longer, but that quickly, as your employee count gets larger, that quickly goes away, which is very consistent with the whole setup of what your survival capability are that we estimated earlier in the paper. Okay, so that brings me to my conclusion. I don't know how I did on time. This is, I've presented this only once before, so hopefully that was fluid enough. So small business survival capabilities vary by firm size, right? And they vary in a way relating to revenue resiliency, labor flexibility, and committed costs. Once you get the ideas of the differences in the pizza and baker and taqueria, it's really fairly obvious, but hopefully it pushes knowledge in a meaningful way. This the low cost structures for non-employers matter, and being able to survive given that they're facing these enormous foot traffic. Micro businesses really depend on that revenue resiliency, and enterprises need the labor flexibility to pivot up and down, right? And importantly, not pushing back on these are both great papers, but the idea that the PPP wasn't successful, it kind of depends. And so then the mapping of the appropriate policy really depends on thinking through these survival ideas. So that's what I have. How did I do, Michael? Am I okay?
Perfect on time, actually. Yeah, exactly 40. Thank you so much. That was great. Our discussant is Chris Stanton from HBS. You have the floor.
So thanks for inviting me to discuss this paper. Is that working? Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, but I think we're having you're in Adobe, not in full screen.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I suppose that's not actually a true state there.
Let's see.
There you go.
There, I think that should help. So thanks for inviting me to read this paper and to discuss it. It's one that I had been meaning to get to for a while. So let me jump right into it. So I think my main takeaway is that if you were going to ask yourself prior to the crisis, what type of small business would have been most resilient in the face of a reduction in revenue, you probably would have said that enterprises or larger small businesses would have been more resilient, in part because they're older and we know that older businesses are less likely to exit, and in part because simply by the fact that they're larger probably means that they're more productive and more sophisticated. And a key question in this paper is how resiliency to COVID varies by firm size. And the results here should probably update your naive prior, in that enterprises have more labor flexibility, but have higher committed costs, which may indicate the need to tailor policy responses rather than having some policy response that targets employment. And so I think that there are a couple of key strengths in this paper, one of which is that the policy discussion here illuminates the importance of substitute policies like unemployment insurance, which may explain some of the lack of PPP take-up that has been documented in a variety of different papers. Now, I'll say this, that there are a bunch of papers trying to estimate or to understand what's happening with small businesses in the time of COVID. I've been writing some of these furiously, which means that I haven't kept up with the literature to the extent that I should have, because there's so much coming out now. And so I think that my comparative advantage here is just to try to compare or triangulate across different results with some of the surveys that I've been running through Alignable with a team of co-authors. And Alignable is just this nationwide network of 5 or 6 million small businesses. And we've just been doing convenience sampling. And so I think there's a question about whether convenience sampling, sending out surveys and asking people to respond, is going to give you something that looks reasonable. And so one sanity check on results across papers is just to see how things line up. And so I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about whether some of the results that we have out of Alignable, many of which I had to reconstruct for the purposes of this discussion to look at how they varied across the firm size distribution, seem to line up here. The main takeaway is that lots is pretty consistent across papers. And so I think that this question about resiliency for enterprises is something that is probably borne out in the data, at least to a first approximation. But there may be some non-monotonicity where you're thinking about sort of firms that are on the larger side of the enterprise distribution, upwards of 40 or 50 employees, that might look a little bit different than the 10 employee firms that probably dominate most of the data, because we know the firm size distribution is skewed. Okay. Here's the organizing framework and the main results. You just have something like cash flows or profits, pi, as a function of revenue, labor costs, and other committed costs. If you think about the effect of a negative shock, this inequality, pi plus the derivative of pi with respect to that shock greater than 0, is going to determine survival. And then you can just totally differentiate to give you different responses or different margins of response to a shock. And so all else equal, firms with a greater ability to adjust labor costs after a negative demand shock are going to be more resilient, but all else here is not equal, as labor flexibility may be correlated with higher committed costs, which leads to the main findings, that enterprises and non-employer firms had greater revenue and foot traffic reductions than micro businesses, which are defined as having 1 to 5 employees, that enterprises reduced headcount more than micro businesses, but despite their greater labor flexibility, enterprises report the largest closure risks, which is indicative of having larger committed costs. I think this is all reasonable, but in what follows, I'm going to potentially push back on a couple of places, one of which is questions about whether there were other things that sort of differentially affected larger businesses that may not have just been a demand shock, and possibly to think about whether businesses of different size had sort of different buffer stocks of savings or access to other outside finance, which would have allowed them to smooth shocks in a different way. Okay, so my first reaction is, why do larger firms have higher percentage declines in revenue? This was kind of the most surprising thing to me, because I would have thought that the incidence of any demand shock would have been relatively stable across the firm size distribution. And I didn't know if larger firms were more likely to answer the survey at different times in March, reflecting different demand conditions, but this is probably not a likely story given the results on foot traffic with day fixed effects that are also larger for enterprises. The second possibility is it's possible that larger firms or enterprises are in busier areas, which may have felt less safe to consumers, causing sort of a larger demand shock for these enterprises. So you might imagine that this pizza restaurant is in an area with high foot traffic, and high foot traffic areas also lead to more proximity with other pedestrians, and so people would have avoided those areas in the face of a health shock. And then the other question that I had, and I wasn't able to really disentangle this, is whether larger firms were more likely to be closed or partially open at the time of the survey. It wasn't sort of clear how to account for that extensive margin change and whether to be operational at all at the time of the survey. And one might sort of have in mind that if you're a larger employer, that there are more employees at an establishment, and that might be a proxy for greater health concerns than just sort of a sole proprietor or someone with 1 or 2 employees. So let me try to disentangle that with some of the data that we have. So we asked in this paper that we published in PNAS earlier this year in a survey from late March to early April about employee health concerns, demand conditions, or supply chain concerns. And I've just plotted how this looks over the firm size distribution. And you can kind of see here that it is at least plausible that employee health concerns may have impacted some of owners' responses, but it doesn't actually seem to appear that changed their opening behavior after you get past something like 10 employees. Now, there is something sort of weird happening between with firm sizes between 6, 7, 8, 9 employees that may fall into this sort of enterprise category that Adair is talking about. But once you get sort of past this 10 employee threshold, it doesn't look like whether at the time of our survey in late March or early April that this would have changed whether the firm was open sort of on the extensive margin or not. A different possibility, however, is that there are supply chain concerns, meaning that larger firms may not have had access to inputs, and that may have changed sort of their ability to realize revenue, even holding fixed sort of latent demand from consumers. And you can kind of see that supply chain concerns are positively correlated with firm size in this early survey that we ran. However, after we ask about sort of orders declining, you can kind of see that there's this sort of non-monotone relationship where the concern about declining orders kind of peaks for either large micro enterprises or large micro businesses or the smallest enterprises, and then kind of falls back down for larger enterprises. And so I think that this was a little bit surprising that this revenue relationship was kind of different across the firm size distribution, but our data do sort of support this might be going on. Okay, the second reaction is that the firm size survival result surprised me. And in our data, at least, this appears robust for firms that had under 20 employees in January. So we asked in this survey what the survival probability would have been through December of 2020 at the time that we were asking businesses in late March or early April. And you can kind of see that these very, very small businesses, either the non-employers or the micro enterprises, here had the highest survival probabilities. And then you get this reduction in survival probabilities with respect to employees up through about 10 to 15 employees. And then for the very largest enterprises, you get this non-monotonicity. And so what I think is probably going on here is that these firms were probably slightly better capitalized or had access to different sources of outside financing, whereas the smaller enterprise businesses likely did not, which does suggest that this result is probably robust, at least for what looks like the smaller sort of enterprises that Adair and Bobby are talking about. The other question here is, how do we think about sort of the cash buffer? So the simple framework here doesn't sort of have any buffer stock of savings by firm size. And what surprised me when I looked at our data, which would have allowed us to look at cash buffers, is when I plot the mean months of cash available by the firm size distribution, it does turn out that smaller firms are holding less cash on the balance, or larger firms are holding less cash on the balance sheet, which may actually make them less resilient. I wouldn't have expected this ex ante, but it does seem like firms that are larger or firms that were thinking about growing probably were a bit more stretched, because if they made an investment in sort of physical assets or a larger physical footprint, it may have meant that their ability to cover those investments early on, if they were thinking about growth or if they were thinking about taking on more operating leverage, may have been somewhat limited. And so I think sort of the balance sheet implications here also point in this direction of having larger enterprises that may have had less ability to sort of buffer some of these shocks. Okay, reaction 3 is that the committed costs here are indirect. And can you say something about what they are? So one possibility would be to try to look at square footage or other fixed costs to validate that committed costs are higher. And then the second question I had is, how big would committed costs need to be to offset the reduction in labor expenses for enterprises to sort of rationalize these survival costs? So can you kind of tell us can you back into how big the committed cost difference would need to be, given that you're finding that labor flexibility is higher for enterprises or larger businesses? And then I guess the last thing that I thought about here is that this is probably specific to this pandemic, but what would the story sort of say in hindsight if you knew that, at least among alignable respondents that we surveyed in May, that 30+% of them reported that they would pay less than their full rent in May. And so I think that this is a really interesting aspect, because if you talk about committed costs with respect to an idiosyncratic shock, there are really no general equilibrium effects there. But if you're thinking about shutting down the whole economy and then you're asking about what a landlord would do to replace a tenant, it's not like there's a new restaurant that's waiting to take over the space of like Zaxby's Pizza or something like that, because no one's going to be able to operate in that time. And so I think sort of the bargaining incidence between committed costs between landlords, tenants, and other enterprises is a pretty interesting way to assess how this pandemic might be different from other pandemics because of the general equilibrium effects. Okay. And then I think if you want to sort of just benchmark what committed costs are, we wrote another working paper on PPP targeting that came out after Adair and Bobby's paper. But this allowed us to try to estimate some of the balance sheet components across enterprises. And you can see that across the firm size distribution, if you look at the elasticity of fixed monthly expenses with respect to January employees, the elasticity here is about 0.4. So a business with 20 employees in January would have had fixed monthly expenses, at least in our data, of about $30,000 a month, compared to something around $15,000 a month for a business that would have had 10 employees in January. So this increase in fixed expenditures does seem to rationalize this committed cost story. So if you take revenue down to 0 for all of these businesses, obviously the larger business is going to have more committed fixed expenditures that they need to continue to pay. So I think this is perfectly consistent with this firm size distribution, or this firm size difference in committed costs that they're documenting. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is the PPP program and other and these results. So this result was probably the most surprising to me, and it probably leaves me maybe the most uncomfortable. And it's because of a function of how the program is set up. So the existing literature suggests PPP may have shifted survival expectations, but overall it had weaker than expected employment effects. And the discussion in the paper suggests that aid wasn't employment, that suggests that a policy that was not employment targeted may have been better served for larger businesses. But larger businesses had larger borrowing bases or bigger borrowing bases, because we know that aid in the PPP program was indexed to employment expenses. And so these firms could have opted to forego forgiveness to use cash on other expenses and had access to something that looked like a low interest loan. Now that loan wouldn't have been forgivable, but it does turn out these firms would have been able to cover a larger share of their fixed expenses because they just had access to more cash. So for those of you who haven't followed the PPP program in detail, the PPP program allowed firms to borrow 2.5 times their average monthly payroll costs for the prior 12 months, which would have meant that bigger businesses were getting larger loan sizes. And there's a question about whether this was fungible or not in terms of whether they could use the cash for alternative uses rather than just labor. Okay, now let me try to make this point a little bit more clear. So if I just take a look at payroll costs over fixed expenses plus payroll costs in our follow-up PPP survey that was conducted in late April and used in our targeting paper, it turns out that larger businesses had much higher payroll costs as a share of total payroll plus fixed expenses, which would have suggested that these firms should have been able to reallocate some of the larger borrowing amount or some of the larger loan amounts that they were getting in order to probably pay off some of their fixed expenses. But it seems like the results here suggest that they were unable to do so, or that they were unwilling to do so. The last thing that I want to just push back on a little bit is around identification. So early on in the crisis, President Trump said anyone who wants a test can get a test, and we know that that was false. But after April 27th, which is the second tranche of the PPP program, where the PPP program got additional funding, the results do suggest that anyone who wanted a PPP loan who was eligible for a PPP loan could have gotten it. And so the survey that they use is a survey that comes out in June, which is after this second tranche. And you can just see here the daily new loan volume and then the cumulative funds in the PPP program from SBA data, which does suggest that the ability to receive a loan as of this June date was either due to some inability to actually qualify for the loan or some revealed preference that the borrower hadn't gone back if they were denied early on here. And so here, this April 16th cutoff was the first tranche of the program. And this was when the program was really supply constrained, but there was a new injection of funds, which then meant that the program was no longer supply constrained after that. And so in our paper, we use sort of the same bank instrument, and we do end up finding, according to papers like Humphreys and the other papers here, that there were quite a large number of frictions in this program, but we actually end up finding that firms with above median payroll have larger treatment effects on firm survival than firms with below median payroll. But we also find some kind of puzzling results for firms with below median fixed expenses, which had slightly higher treatment effects as well. So the bottom line here is I think that the paper is right to think about the portfolio effects of policies available and their incidence on different firms. And this is likely true beyond this pandemic, but it's also important for understanding future policy. But I think it's probably important to triangulate around different estimates of the incidence of the PPP program and what it would mean. The last thing that I'll say is that I think this paper is going to be really important in sort of understanding the conditions on the ground from a variety of perspectives. And I've never seen a paper that has linked to the SafeGraph data with business outcomes and survey data. And so I think that we're capturing a really important point in time. I'll conclude by saying that the point in time that we're discussing in terms of the policy implications, the modal respondent thought that this was a shock that was going to end in June. And so the policies were initially set to maintain matches between firms and labor. And that's why we probably saw this subsidizing labor so that we didn't see sort of mass unemployment long term. Here, this is just responses from a survey where we asked when respondents would believe that that COVID disruptions would be over, and 50% said this was going to be done by June. When we asked again in May, obviously this timeline for when COVID responses would be over has shifted out dramatically. And so I think now, if you're thinking about tailoring labor, you have a very different or targeting policy toward labor. You have a very different calculus. And so I think that they're absolutely correct that a policy that probably targets committed expenses or fixed expenses looks very different, at least in the climate where they're talking about respondents who were responding in June, who then said, that if they had higher fixed or committed expenses, that they're much less optimistic about survival. And so I think that that might be a way to rationalize some of the stuff that we were finding at the early tranche of PPP versus their later June responses, where firms that had higher committed expenses were now projecting something like a much longer crisis duration overall. Anyway, I know I went over. I had a lot to say. I really think that this paper is important and is well done. And so it's been a real pleasure to discuss it. Thanks.